Nobody expects to get fired during an all-hands meeting with 32 people watching, but that's exactly what happened to me last October. What my boss Darius Henley didn't expect was for me to turn on my screen share and show everyone exactly why he was really firing me. By the time I was done, he wasn't just embarrassed, he was unemployed. And I had an inbox full of job offers from companies that had been trying to poach me for years. But let me back up, because this story doesn't start with that Zoom call. It starts 9 months earlier, with a handshake, and a promise that turned out to be worth absolutely nothing. My name is Meredith, and I've been a software engineer for 9 years. The last 3 of those years were spent at Technova Solutions, a mid-sized company that specialized in automation software for healthcare systems. When I joined Technova, they were a mess. Their main product was buggy, their development team was burned out, and they were hemorrhaging clients faster than they could sign new ones. The previous CTO had quit without notice, leaving behind a codebase that looked like it had been written by 12 different people who had never spoken to each other. I was brought in as a senior developer with the understanding that I'd be leading the technical overhaul. For 2.5 years, that's exactly what I did. I rebuilt their entire patient data processing system from the ground up. I established coding standards, implemented automated testing, and created documentation that actually made sense. I mentored junior developers, debugged legacy systems, and worked 16-hour days to meet impossible deadlines. By the time Darius Henley showed up, Technova had transformed from a company on the verge of bankruptcy to one of the most respected healthcare automation providers in the region. Our client retention rate had gone from 60% to 94%. Our software was processing medical records for over 200 hospitals across 12 states. Our development team had grown from 5 overworked engineers to 15 talented professionals who actually enjoyed coming to work. I had built something I was genuinely proud of. And then Darius decided he wanted to tear it all down. Darius came to us from Megatech Industries, one of those corporate giants where executives speak fluent buzzword and middle management is an art form. He had 20 years of experience, an MBA from Wharton, and absolutely no idea what our software actually did. But he interviewed well, impressed the board with his talk about scalability and market positioning, and convinced Dr. Evelyn Carstairs, our CEO, that he could take Technova to the next level. His first week, Darius scheduled one-on-one meetings with every member of the engineering team. When my turn came, I walked into the conference room expecting a typical get-to-know-you conversation. Instead, I got a lecture about the importance of being a team player and supporting new leadership initiatives. "Meredith," he said, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his own importance. "I've been reviewing your work, and I can see you've been instrumental in getting this company to where it is today." I nodded, waiting for the but that was clearly coming. "But," he continued right on cue, "as we scale up and move into enterprise-level solutions, we need to think bigger. We need to think about industry standards, modern frameworks, cutting-edge methodologies. The systems you've built are fine for where we were, but they're not going to take us where we need to go." I kept my expression neutral, but inside I was incredulous. The systems I'd built were handling millions of transactions without errors. They'd passed every security audit, met every compliance requirement, and satisfied every client need. But Darius had been on the job for exactly 5 days, and he'd already decided they weren't good enough. "What specific changes are you thinking about?" I asked. "Complete modernization," he said, pulling out a tablet and showing me a presentation he'd apparently prepared in advance. "Migration to microservices architecture, implementation of containerized deployment, integration with cloud-native solutions. I'm talking about rebuilding everything from scratch using industry best practices." And I looked at his slides, buzzwords and diagrams that looked impressive but demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of what our software needed to do. "Darius," I said carefully, "our current system processes sensitive medical records in real time for critical healthcare operations. Any migration would need to maintain 100% uptime while ensuring zero data corruption. That's not a 6-month project. That's an 18-month project, minimum. And the risk is just another word for opportunity," he interrupted. "Meredith, I can see you're attached to what you've built here, and I respect that. But sometimes you have to be willing to sacrifice good for great. That should have been my first warning that this man had no idea what he was talking about. In healthcare software, you don't sacrifice good for great. You sacrifice everything else for absolutely bulletproof reliability, because when your system goes down, people can die. But I was still trying to be professional, still trying to give him the benefit of the doubt. I'm definitely open to improvements, I said. Maybe we could start with some smaller optimizations and see how they perform before committing to a complete rebuild. Darius smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I appreciate your caution, but we need to move fast if we want to stay competitive. I'll be bringing in some consultants from my previous company to help with the transition. People who have experience with large-scale implementations. And that's when I knew I was in trouble. Over the next month, Darius hired 4 consultants from Megatech Industries. Each one was making twice what our senior developers earned, and each one specialized in exactly the type of trendy framework that Darius wanted to implement. They showed up to meetings with expensive laptops and practice presentations, ready to explain why everything we'd built was obsolete. The first consultant was Braxton Mills, a solutions architect, who spent 3 days analyzing our codebase before announcing that it was legacy infrastructure incompatible with modern scalability requirements. When I asked him to identify specific scalability issues, he handed me a 40-page report full of generic recommendations that could have applied to any software company. The second consultant was Skylar Davidson, a DevOps evangelist, who wanted to containerize our entire application stack. This would have been fine, except our clients specifically required on-premise installations with air-gapped security configurations. When I explained this, Skylar suggested we convince our clients to change their security requirements to accommodate modern deployment strategies. The third consultant was Phoenix Rodriguez, a user experience strategist who had never worked with healthcare software before, but was confident that our interfaces needed complete redesign. Phoenix spent 2 weeks creating mock-ups that looked beautiful and would have been completely unusable for emergency room staff working 18-hour shifts. The fourth consultant was Camden Wright, a technical project manager, whose job seemed to be explaining to the rest of us why Darius's ideas were brilliant and why our concerns were outdated thinking. Between the 4 of them, these consultants were costing Technova $48,000 per month. For that price, we could have hired 2 additional full-time senior developers and actually improved our systems instead of planning to replace them. But the cost wasn't the worst part. The worst part was watching Darius slowly push aside everyone who had built the company's success while elevating people who had been there for less than a month. In our weekly engineering meetings, Darius started asking the consultants for their opinions before asking those of us who actually maintained the systems. When clients called with technical questions, he began redirecting them to Braxton instead of me, even though I was the one who had built the solutions they were asking about. When Dr. Carstairs requested updates on development progress, Darius presented reports written by Camden that described my work as if it had been supervised and guided by his new team. I tried to address this diplomatically. I scheduled a private meeting with Darius to discuss role clarity and project ownership. I thought maybe he didn't realize how his actions were being perceived, or maybe there was some miscommunication about responsibilities. Darius, I said, I wanted to talk about how we're handling client communications and project presentations. I'm noticing that some of my work is being presented without attribution, and I'm concerned that clients might start to think I'm not involved in solutions that I actually developed. He leaned back in his chair and gave me that practiced smile again. Meredith, I think you're misunderstanding the bigger picture here. Individual credit is less important than team success. What matters is that Technova delivers excellent results to our clients. Whether they know exactly who wrote which code is irrelevant. But it's not irrelevant to me, I said. And it's not irrelevant to the clients who specifically request to work with me because they trust my expertise. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need to move away from, Darius replied. Personal relationships with clients create dependencies that aren't scalable. As we grow, we need clients to have confidence in Technova as an organization, not in individual contributors. I stared at him. Darius, these clients trust me because I've solved their problems for 3 years. I know their systems, their workflows, their specific requirements. You can't just replace institutional knowledge with organizational branding. Actually, he said, that's exactly what successful companies do. They build processes and frameworks that don't depend on any single person. What happens if you get hit by a bus tomorrow? Does Technova fail because Meredith Chen is irreplaceable? The question was clearly rhetorical, but I answered it anyway. If I got hit by a bus tomorrow, Technova would continue to function because I've documented everything I've built, trained my colleagues on every system I maintain, and created processes that can be followed by anyone with appropriate technical skills. But those systems would be less effective without the person who designed them, just like every other complex technical solution in existence. Darius shook his head. I think we have fundamentally different philosophies about software development and team management. Moving forward, I need to know that my technical leads are aligned with the direction I'm taking this company. And what direction is that? Modern, scalable, enterprise-ready solutions that position Technova for exponential growth. Solutions that don't depend on legacy thinking or individual expertise. I left that meeting with a sick feeling in my stomach. Darius wasn't just planning to rebuild our software. He was planning to rebuild our entire organizational culture, and there wasn't going to be room in it for people who questioned his vision. That's when I started documenting everything. I began keeping detailed records of every meeting, every email, every decision that seemed questionable. At first, it was just for my own protection. I wanted to have evidence if Darius tried to blame me for problems created by his consultants. But as the weeks went by, the documentation became more comprehensive and more damning. I saved emails where Darius took credit for system improvements that I had designed and implemented. I recorded meeting notes where he presented my technical recommendations as his own strategic insights. I kept copies of client communications where he positioned himself as the primary technical contact for accounts that I had been managing for years. The most egregious example happened in July, when I identified a critical security vulnerability in our data encryption process. This wasn't a small bug. It was a fundamental flaw that could have exposed patient records and resulted in millions of dollars in HIPAA violations. If left unpatched, it could have destroyed the company. I spent 2 weeks analyzing the vulnerability, developing a fix, and testing the solution across all our systems. It required understanding not just our code base, but the specific regulatory requirements that governed healthcare data security. The solution I created was elegant, secure, and required zero downtime for implementation. I submitted my findings to Darius with a detailed report explaining the vulnerability, the risks it posed, and the technical approach I had used to resolve it. I expected acknowledgement, maybe even praise for preventing a potential catastrophe. Instead, when Darius presented the quarterly security report to the board of directors, he described the vulnerability fix as part of his new cybersecurity initiatives. He never mentioned my name. He never mentioned the weeks of work I had put into identifying and resolving the issue. He presented it as if the discovery and solution had been the result of his strategic oversight and improved security processes. When I asked him about this privately, he told me that individual contributions were less important than demonstrating the effectiveness of his leadership to the board. He said that highlighting specific employees could create the impression that security was dependent on particular individuals rather than robust organizational systems. Besides, he added, you were just doing your job. Security is supposed to be everyone's responsibility. Just doing my job. Preventing a multi-million-dollar data breach that could have destroyed the company was just doing my job. That's when I realized that no amount of competence, no level of contribution, no degree of indispensability was going to protect me from Darius's ego and ambition. He didn't see me as a valuable team member to be developed and supported. He saw me as a threat to be managed and eventually eliminated. So I started preparing for war. I created encrypted backups of all my documentation. I copied every email, every technical specification, every piece of evidence that demonstrated my contributions to the company. I researched employment law, consulted with a labor attorney, and began building a case that would protect me if Darius decided to retaliate against me for challenging his authority. But I didn't expect him to be stupid enough to fire me in front of the entire company. The October 15th all-hands meeting was supposed to be routine. These quarterly meetings were standard practice at Technova. The CEO would review company performance. Department heads would present updates on their initiatives, and everyone would spend an hour pretending to care about metrics and strategic objectives. I logged into the Zoom call at 9:58 a.m., 2 minutes before the scheduled start time. My home office was neat, my background was professional, and I had a cup of coffee and a notebook ready for whatever corporate theater was about to unfold. Dr. Evelyn Carstairs opened the meeting with the usual pleasantries. Thanks for attending. Exciting quarter ahead. Proud of our team's accomplishments. Then she handed the presentation over to Darius for the engineering department update. Darius shared his screen and began clicking through slides about development progress, technical initiatives, and future roadmap planning. He talked about the consultant integration process, the system modernization timeline, and the organizational improvements he had implemented since joining the company. Everything he described sounded impressive, visionary, forward-thinking. He just failed to mention that most of the actual work had been done by people who weren't him. I was only half paying attention, honestly. These presentations were usually 90% buzzwords and 10% useful information. I was reviewing my own project notes when Darius advanced to a slide titled Team Transitions and Strategic Realignment. As we continue to evolve our technical capabilities and scale our operations, Darius said, his voice taking on that formal corporate tone that managers use when they're about to ruin someone's day, we need to make some strategic adjustments to ensure our team composition aligns with our long-term objectives. I looked up from my notes. Around me, in the little video windows scattered across my screen, I could see my colleagues paying closer attention. Organizational changes were always anxiety-inducing, especially when announced without warning during all-hands meetings. Effective immediately, Darius continued, and I felt my stomach drop even before he said my name. We'll be transitioning Meredith Chen out of her current role to pursue opportunities that better align with her skill set and career aspirations. The silence was absolute. 32 people on a video call, and not one of them made a sound. I could see faces frozen in shock, hands covering mouths, people clearly scrambling to process what they had just heard. I was being fired, on a company-wide Zoom call, in front of every colleague I had worked with for 3 years. No warning, no private conversation, no opportunity to defend myself or ask questions. Just a corporate euphemism delivered like a line item in a budget report. Meredith, Darius said, and his voice was steady, professional, completely devoid of emotion or humanity. We appreciate your contributions to Teknova during your tenure here, and we wish you the best as you pursue new challenges that better match your professional goals and technical interests. That was it. 3 years of building the company's most critical systems, 3 years of 60-hour weeks and emergency debugging sessions, 3 years of turning a failing startup into a successful business, reduced to 2 sentences of corporate doublespeak delivered in front of everyone I respected. I stared at my screen, at all those shocked faces looking back at me. My friend Zara from the QA team had tears in her eyes. Marcus from DevOps was shaking his head in disbelief. Even people from sales and marketing looked stunned by the casual cruelty of what had just happened. Are there any questions about our Q4 development priorities? Darius asked, as if he hadn't just publicly humiliated the person who had built most of the systems he was planning to manage. That's when something inside me crystallized. Not anger, exactly. Something colder, more focused. I looked at my screen, at all those faces staring back at me in shock and sympathy, and I realized I had something that most people never get when they're fired. I had an audience, and I had evidence. I moved my cursor to the share screen button and clicked it. Actually, Darius, I said, and my voice was calm, steady, surprisingly controlled. I think there are a few things people should know before I pursue those new opportunities. I watched Darius's face appear in a small window as my screen share took over the main display. His expression shifted from professional confidence to confusion to something approaching panic. Meredith, that's really not necessary. Oh, but I think it is, I said, opening the folder I had been building for 3 months. Dozens of files, meticulously organized, all labeled with dates and clear descriptions. 3 months of stolen credit, documented lies, and systematic undermining, all organized into a presentation that would have made Darius's Megatech consultants proud. For instance, I continued, clicking on the first subfolder, people should probably know about the security vulnerability that almost resulted in a massive HIPAA violation back in July, the one that could have exposed patient records for 200 hospitals and cost Teknova millions of dollars in fines and lawsuits. I opened an email thread, displaying it for everyone to see. My initial vulnerability report, complete with technical analysis and risk assessment, my proposed solution, with detailed implementation notes and testing protocols. My final confirmation that the fix had been successfully deployed across all systems. This is the work I did to identify and resolve that vulnerability, I said. 2 weeks of analysis, testing, and implementation. 0 downtime, 0 data loss, 0 regulatory violations. I scrolled down to show Darius's quarterly board presentation, where he had described the security fix as part of his cybersecurity initiative. No mention of my name, no acknowledgement of my work, no indication that the discovery and solution had come from anyone other than his strategic oversight. And this is how Darius presented that work to the board of directors, I said, as his cybersecurity initiative, his strategic planning, his leadership. I could hear people typing furiously in the background, probably taking screenshots or sending private messages. A few people had turned their cameras off, but most were staring in fascination as 3 months of systematic credit theft played out in real time. Or maybe, I continued, opening another folder, people should know about the client retention strategies that brought our renewal rate from 60% to 94% over the past 2 years. More emails, more documentation, client communication showing my direct involvement in problem-solving and relationship management, technical solutions I had developed for specific customer needs, testimonials from hospital administrators who specifically praised my expertise and responsiveness. This is what our clients say about the work I've done for them, I said, displaying a series of emails from satisfied customers. Direct quotes about the value I've provided, the problems I've solved, the trust I've built over 3 years of consistent performance. I scrolled to another section showing Darius's recent communications with those same clients, where he had positioned himself as their primary technical contact and described my work as part of his team's improved service delivery. And this is how Darius has been presenting himself to those clients, I said, as their main point of contact, as the person responsible for their satisfaction, as the leader of the team that built their solutions. Meredith, this is highly inappropriate, Darius said, and his voice was shaking now. I'm going to have to ask you to stop sharing your screen and end this presentation. You know what's inappropriate? I replied, clicking through to another folder. This email where you told the Morrison Healthcare team that you personally redesigned their patient data processing system. The system I built from scratch while you were still learning how to navigate our development environment. The Morrison Healthcare email was particularly damning because it included technical details that Darius couldn't possibly have understood without my documentation. He had copied entire paragraphs from my system specifications and presented them as his own analysis and recommendations. Or this email thread, I continued, opening a Slack conversation, where you told the engineering team that my concerns about the microservices migration were just resistance to change and outdated thinking, while privately, you were asking me to write detailed technical documentation explaining exactly why that migration would fail and what risks it would create for our clients. I displayed the Slack conversation alongside my private email correspondence with Darius, showing how he had publicly dismissed my expertise while privately relying on it for his own decision-making. Documentation that you then used to quietly abandon the microservices project while telling everyone it was your strategic decision to maintain our current architecture, I added. More typing. Someone, I think it was Zara, had unmuted herself and was making quiet sounds of disbelief. A few people were openly shaking their heads at their cameras. That's enough, Darius said, trying to sound authoritative, but his voice cracked slightly. I'm ending this meeting right now. Actually, said a voice I didn't immediately recognize, I'd like to hear more of this presentation. I looked at the participant list and felt my heart skip. Dr. Evelyn Carstairs, our CEO, had joined the call. She must have been alerted when the meeting started going sideways. Please continue, Meredith, Dr. Carstairs said, and her voice was ice-cold professional. This is very illuminating. I clicked through to my final folder, the one I had been saving for last. This might be the most interesting part, I said. The communications where Darius specifically instructed me to downplay my contributions in client meetings and technical presentations. I opened an email thread that made my stomach turn every time I read it. Including this exchange where he told me that healthcare executives respond better to senior male engineers for high-level technical discussions, and that I should focus on documentation and support tasks while he handled client-facing responsibilities. The email was displayed in full. Meredith, I need you to take a more supportive role in the Morrison presentation next week. Healthcare execs tend to be more comfortable with senior male engineers for strategic technical discussions. You can handle the documentation and detailed specs while I present the high-level architecture and roadmap. This isn't about your capabilities. It's about positioning Technova for maximum client confidence. The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the sound of typing. I could see people's faces in their video windows, and the expressions ranged from shock to anger to disgust. He said, "What now?" That was Marcus, his voice tight with fury. "There's more," I said, scrolling down to show Darius's follow-up email. When I questioned this decision, he explained that client perception management was a key part of scaling our business, and that my role needed to evolve to support strategic objectives rather than individual recognition. I displayed another email where Darius had suggested that my visibility concerns were evidence of poor team collaboration and an inability to prioritize company success over personal credit. And finally, I said, opening one last email thread, this exchange from last week, where Darius informed HR that my performance had been declining and that he had serious concerns about my ability to work collaboratively with the new technical leadership team. The HR email was devastating. Darius had documented a pattern of resistance to change, territorial behavior, and difficulty accepting feedback that painted me as a problem employee who was hindering the department's progress. This was sent 3 days after I successfully launched the automated testing system that has eliminated 96% of our deployment bugs, I said. The same system that Darius has been describing to clients as evidence of his improved development processes. I stopped sharing my screen and looked directly into my camera. So yes, Darius is transitioning me out of my role. But I think everyone should understand exactly why, exactly what the company is losing, and exactly what kind of leadership they're getting in return. The Zoom call was completely silent. 32 people. And nobody was moving, nobody was speaking, nobody was even typing. Just 32 video windows full of shocked, angry, or disgusted faces. Dr. Carstairs spoke first. Darius, I need to see you in a private meeting immediately. Everyone else, please consider this meeting concluded for now. Meredith, please stay online. I'd like to speak with you as well. The call ended abruptly, but my phone was already buzzing. Text messages from colleagues, LinkedIn notifications, emails from people who had somehow heard about what happened within minutes of it occurring. But the most interesting message came 20 minutes later, from Dr. Carstairs herself. Meredith, I've spoken with Darius and reviewed the documentation you presented. Would you be available for a conversation this afternoon? I think we have quite a bit to discuss. That conversation lasted 4 hours. Dr. Carstairs, myself, the head of HR, and the company's legal counsel spent the entire afternoon going through every piece of evidence I had collected. Email threads, project documentation, client communications, performance reviews, everything that demonstrated the systematic theft of my work and the deliberate undermining of my position. What I learned during that meeting was that I wasn't the first person Darius had treated this way. Dr. Carstairs had been receiving anonymous complaints for months about his management style, his tendency to take credit for others' work, and his dismissive attitude toward female engineers. 2 other women had already left the company rather than continue working under his leadership, but they had been too afraid of retaliation to make formal complaints. My public documentation had provided the evidence she needed to take action, but it had also exposed the company to potential lawsuits from employees who had been discriminated against under Darius's management. Meredith, Dr. Carstairs said near the end of our conversation, I owe you an apology. I hired Darius because I thought he could take our technical capabilities to the next level. I didn't realize that he would systematically undermine the people who had built those capabilities in the first place. She offered me Darius's position that same day. CTO, with a 40% salary increase, equity options that reflected my actual contributions to the company's success, and complete authority over technical decision-making. She also offered to provide references for any external opportunities I might prefer to pursue, acknowledging that the company might not be able to recover from the damage Darius had done to our culture. I asked for 24 hours to consider the offer. That evening, I sat in my home office, looking at the same computer screen where I had been fired 8 hours earlier. My phone was buzzing constantly with messages from colleagues, recruiters, and even competitors who had heard about the Zoom call and wanted to offer me positions. But what struck me most was a message from Zara, my friend from the QA team. "Meredith, what you did today was the bravest thing I've ever seen in corporate America. You showed all of us that we don't have to accept being treated like garbage just because someone has a fancy title." Another message came from Marcus. "I've been keeping my own documentation since Darius arrived. After seeing what you did, I think it's time I talk to HR about some things too." And another from Isabella, one of our junior developers. "Thank you for standing up for yourself and for all of us. You showed me that competence and documentation are more powerful than politics and intimidation." That's when I realized that my decision wasn't just about my own career. It was about the kind of workplace culture I wanted to be part of building. I called Dr. Carstairs the next morning and accepted the CTO position. Darius was terminated that afternoon. Not in a public Zoom call with 32 people watching, but in a quiet meeting with HR and legal counsel. His access to company systems was revoked immediately. His consulting contracts were canceled, and his LinkedIn profile still lists him as seeking new opportunities in technical leadership. The consultants he had hired were dismissed the same day. Braxton, Schuyler, Phoenix, and Camden all found themselves suddenly unemployed, their expensive expertise no longer needed by a company that had decided to invest in the people who actually understood the business. As for me, I've been CTO of Technova for 8 months now. I've implemented new policies around credit attribution and project ownership. I've created mentorship programs for junior developers and established clear documentation requirements for all technical decisions. I've built a culture where competence is rewarded, contributions are acknowledged, and nobody gets fired in front of their colleagues without due process. Our client retention rate is now 97%. Our development team has grown by 50%, and we haven't had a single person quit since I took over. We've launched 3 new products, expanded into 2 additional markets, and increased our annual revenue by 38%. But the most satisfying part isn't the business metrics or the financial success. It's the knowledge that when someone tried to erase my contributions and steal my work, I had the tools and the backbone to make sure everyone saw exactly what was happening. The video of that Zoom call, yes, someone recorded it, has been shared thousands of times across tech forums, professional development websites, and social media platforms. It's become a case study in toxic management, workplace documentation, and the importance of standing up for yourself in corporate environments. I've received hundreds of messages from other women in tech who shared their own stories of stolen credit, public humiliation, and systematic undermining. Many of them have used my experience as inspiration to start documenting their own workplace situations and demanding the recognition they deserve. Some people have asked me if I regret how I handled the situation, if I think I should have been more professional or more discreet. But here's what I've learned. Professionalism is supposed to work both ways. If someone wants to fire you publicly and humiliate you in front of your colleagues, they need to be prepared for you to defend yourself publicly and demonstrate exactly why their decision was wrong. If someone wants to steal credit for your work and present your expertise as their own accomplishment, they need to be prepared for you to show receipts that prove otherwise. And if someone wants to create a hostile work environment based on discrimination and ego, they need to be prepared for the consequences when their behavior is exposed. I spent 3 years building Technova's technical success while someone else collected the praise and recognition. I spent months documenting the systematic theft of my work, while believing that quiet professionalism and superior performance would eventually win out. It took getting fired in front of 32 people to realize that sometimes the most professional thing you can do is make sure the truth gets told, no matter how uncomfortable it makes people. 9 months later, Technova is thriving under my leadership. Our development team is diverse, collaborative, and innovative in ways that go far beyond implementing the latest technological trends. We solve real problems for real healthcare providers, and everyone who contributes gets credit for their work. We've built a culture where competence matters more than politics, where documentation protects everyone, and where nobody gets thrown under the bus to protect someone else's ego. And Darius? Last I heard, he was working as a freelance consultant, helping small companies implement the same microservices architectures and containerized deployments that he wanted to force on us. I'm sure he's doing fine. After all, he's got plenty of experience taking credit for other people's work. The difference is, Now everyone knows exactly what that looks like when it's exposed to the light.